The woman who knelt beneath the carved arches of Westminster Abbey was not meant to survive. She had once been a prisoner in the tower whose very breath depended on the silence of those who hated her. There was no refusal to attend, no ambassador sneering at her legitimacy. The child once called Bastarda now received the ring of mystical marriage to England. The loops lost symmetry. The lines wavered. The hand of the child prodigy trembled beneath the shadow of execution. She had seen too many towers not to know what came next. Her words begged not for pardon, but for proof. Let me not be condemned without cause. She knew it was not justice that hunted her, but politics in a crimson mask. Still, she finished the letter, then drew long diagonal strokes across the empty space. A safeguard against forgers, a locked page, a sealed soul. Mary did not answer. The tower did. On the morning of March 18th, Elizabeth was led down to the waiting barge. Rain fell in slow knives. As she stepped aboard, her voice broke through the silence not as a scream, not as a protest, but as a quiet invocation. I am no traitor. The boatman said nothing. The river said nothing. The tower, with its ravens and rusted locks, opened its mouth to receive her. The stones remembered screams. The air held the ghost of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth walked the same path her mother had, up the same slippery steps, beneath the same grey sky. Soldiers bowed before her, some out of pity, others out of guilt. She was taken to the belled tower, confined not in darkness but in echo. For 8 weeks, she waited, alone. Each day began with prayers and ended with silence. She read psalms, she watched the rain, and she listened for footsteps that never came. Across the yard stood the site where her mother's blood had soaked the grass. She imagined the sound of that final breath. She imagined her own. Fear is not loud, it is slow. It drips, it repeats, it folds itself into thought. She did not cry. She did not scream. She endured. The interrogators came again, hungry for a crack, a contradiction. Cat Ashley was still imprisoned. Servants betrayed secrets. Elizabeth remained a locked box. She knew now that every emotion could be used against her. Every slip of the tongue could become a noose. She mastered stillness. Then, one morning, the clank of armor outside her door signaled change. Sir Henry Bedingfield stood with 100 guards, the Queen's loyal servant, the Queen's unspoken threat. He came not with an execution order, but with a transfer. Elizabeth was to be removed, not freed. On her 4th finger, a symbol not of romance, but of submission to no man but the nation. As she processed through Westminster on carpets of blue cloth, they cut away the fabric beneath her feet to keep as relics. She was taken to Woodstock, an old manor overgrown with ivy and memory. Bedingfield followed her like a shadow, locking gates, intercepting letters, allowing no visitors unsupervised. She called him my jailer. He called her your grace. They danced the language of captivity for nearly a year. Meanwhile, fires burned. Mary's England became a kingdom of flame. Protestants, real or imagined, were tried, dragged, and tied to stakes. Over 300 met this fate, burned not for sedition, but for conscience. The air in London reeked of ash and faith, and Elizabeth, once Protestant by education, now Protestant by necessity, watched. She said little. She requested books. She read of martyrs, of saints, of smoke. But she chose silence over sermons. She saw what happened to those who shouted. Mary's phantom pregnancy offered a brief opening. The Queen, swollen with hope and clutched by illusion, summoned Elizabeth to court, perhaps to witness a birth, perhaps to name an heir, perhaps to chain her once and for all. Elizabeth went carefully. Her steps were measured, her words weighed. She kissed her sister's hand. She complimented the court. She spoke of obedience, of blood, of shared lineage. But when the Queen demanded attendance at Mass, Elizabeth begged for instruction, claiming she had never been taught the old ways. A stalling tactic, a performance. On the morning she was to attend, she claimed illness, a stomach ache, a fever, a wound that did not bleed but could not be ignored. Mary saw through it. So did everyone, but she could not act. Not yet. Philip of Spain, the foreign husband no one wanted, grew impatient. He saw in Elizabeth a tool, a bargaining chip, a bride. He proposed matches. Elizabeth declined politely, decisively. She would not be ruled. She would not be sold. She would not burn. And still, she waited. She did not inherit the crown by divine right, but by exhaustion of bloodlines, of prayers, of a kingdom too weary to burn again. When Mary's body began to fail, there were no heirs swaddled in velvet, no miracle sons to save the old faith. The womb that had once defied hope gave only silence. But what they truly wanted was not cloth. They wanted her image, her soul, her body politic transformed into myth, even in death. Mary hesitated to name her sister a successor. Pride was a stubborn god. But the council knew. England knew. The only woman left standing in a court of ashes was Elizabeth, and the air trembled with it. 10 days before Mary died, the resistance broke. The name Elizabeth was spoken not in whispers, but in Latin, in law, in prophecy. On November 17th, 1558, the messengers came to Hatfield. She was walking in the deer park when they found her, under an ancient oak. The sky pressed low above her head. They knelt. She did not immediately. Her eyes rose to the branches as if reading scripture in the bark. Then she sank to her knees and whispered words no one forgot. A domino factum est illud, et est mirabile in oculis nostris. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. Some called it humility. Others heard defiance. She did not thank Mary. She did not weep. The throne had waited long enough, and now it was hers. But coronation is not victory. It is vow. Elizabeth knew better than most that a crown is not a guarantee, but a question. Can she hold it? Can she carry it without falling? Can a woman rule not by marriage, nor by motherhood, but by mind? Her procession into London was no mere celebration. It was a test of vision. She rode not as the daughter of Anne Boleyn, not as the sister of Mary, but as an idea. She was clad in white, the color of purity, of virginity, of deathless resolve. The people cheered, but their memories were short and their swords sharp. Elizabeth knew that. She waved, she smiled, she spoke of unity, but her eyes saw deeper, into windows, into alleys, into the unspoken doubts of men raised to believe that only sons could lead. Westminster awaited her like a cathedral of judgment. The carpets rolled out before her were not cloth, they were canvas, and on them she walked like a brush dipped in blood and gold. In Westminster Abbey, where kings had slept beneath stone and incense, Elizabeth stood alive. She bowed. She swore. She knelt, not in submission, but in choreography. The anointing oil kissed her brow, her breast, her palms. 7 places, 7 wounds, 7 seals. Her body became sacred not through lineage, but through ritual. A myth that could calm a country fractured by war, burnt by religious vengeance, and exhausted by failed heirs. And then came the crowns, 3 of them, one after another, placed with trembling hands on her head, each heavier than the last. They were not just ornaments, they were burdens. One for the realm, one for the church, one for the myth. She bore them all. And then the ring slipped onto her finger as if by a groom. But no man stood beside her. She was wed not to a husband, but to England itself. The ring gleamed like a promise forged in fire. I will not belong to anyone but the land I rule. Outside, bells rang. Inside, the air thickened with incense and expectation. Elizabeth said little. The performance was complete, but the reality had only begun. Her reign would be no golden age at the start. It would be built in silence, in scrutiny, in careful calculation. She would not sign every death warrant with ease. She would not trust every whisper of loyalty. She had seen too much. Her first council was not a circle of friends, it was a table of doubters. Her first speeches were not declarations, they were defenses. But the country watched, and the country waited. And slowly, they saw something they had never seen: a woman who did not flinch, who did not kneel to foreign kings, who did not marry to secure power, but held it in her own hand. And in that hand, no ring ever changed. The Virgin Queen, so they called her. But it was not chastity that defined her. It was control. In a world where every woman was told to submit, Elizabeth built a throne out of refusal. Refusal to wed. Refusal to bear. Refusal to explain. Her solitude was not weakness, it was warning. Do not mistake absence for emptiness. Do not mistake stillness for surrender. She had known the tower. She had known shame. She had known the heat of accusation and the chill of abandonment. The woman on that road had no husband, no heir, no guarantee. She walked alone, wrapped not in furs or jewels, but in the silent scream of every woman who had never been allowed to rule. And yet she stood, crowned and unshaken, the last Tudor, the first to survive not by accident, but by design. Her portrait would hang in halls across the world, eyes wide, hands steady, every inch of cloth scripted with allegory. Behind her, the storm. Before her, the stage. She wore the mask of monarchy like a second skin, not to deceive, but to protect. The girl who once feared the sound of footsteps outside her chamber was gone. In her place stood a sovereign who had mastered the echo. Elizabeth did not promise peace. She did not offer motherhood. She did not feign humility. What she gave them, what she gave history, was something rarer: presence. Unyielding, undeniable presence. And as the bells of Westminster continued to toll and the oil on her skin dried into memory, England, for the first time, belonged to a woman who owed no one her survival. Behind her, a father who beheaded wives for sons, a mother who died for love, and a half-sister who burned heretics to preserve old gods. Ahead of her, a realm divided, nobles who doubted, a papacy enraged, and a throne still damp from death. Elizabeth did not claim power with affection. She claimed it with performance. She wore the Book of Hours like armor, and silence like a blade. She had studied the language of rule from the margins, and now she was the center. Not long before her coronation, a Spanish ambassador wrote of her, "She is determined to be governed by no one." They meant it as an insult. She took it as doctrine. For Elizabeth knew these thrones are not inherited, they are survived. She had watched the realm turn against her faith, her body, her very existence, and now every bell in London rang not to mourn, but to crown. She entered the world not as a daughter, but as a disappointment. The bells of celebration rang not for her name, but for the boy the astrologers had promised and fate had denied. The birth of Elizabeth Tudor in September 1533 should have confirmed Henry VIII's divine blessing, an heir to secure the Tudor line. Instead, it fractured his illusions. The child was a girl, and though her christening proceeded with the pomp reserved for kings, the truth whispered beneath the incense she was not what England had prayed for. From the first breath, she was entangled in power she could not wield. Her father, already restless with ambition and desire, watched his second wife Anne Boleyn fail in the very duty for which he had torn England from Rome, she could not give him a living son. Miscarriages and stillbirths followed, and the cradle that once held hope became a coffin of expectation. Then came the accusations: adultery, incest, treason, all charges designed not merely to kill Anne, but to erase her. Elizabeth was only 2 when her mother's head fell in a single stroke of a French sword. No axe, no slow death, just silence, swift and ceremonial. Her mother vanished from memory not by accident, but by royal will. The very name Anne Boleyn became an absence, a forbidden utterance in court, a void in portraits, a ghost behind every guarded word. Elizabeth, meanwhile, remained stripped of title, declared illegitimate, transformed overnight from princess to bastard. The decree was political, but its cruelty was personal. Her royal nursery fell quiet. Servants who once bowed now hesitated, even her governess. Lady Bryan wrote to Cromwell with pleading confusion what should be done with the child now that she was neither heir nor honored. Could she at least have warm clothes? Since she had outgrown everything and no longer received royal livery, and above all, where should she eat? Was she to be seen at table with nobility, or hidden in her chamber like a mistake too delicate to confront? These were not mere logistics. They were negotiations of identity. In the Tudor court, where status was everything, even the placement of a plate determined worth. Elizabeth ate alone, away from the court. She was raised in the countryside, a daughter no longer claimed, a relic of a mother erased. Yet she was not forgotten. She was, after all, the child for whom a kingdom had been broken and a church remade. On a rain-slicked January morning in 1559, Elizabeth Tudor was anointed Queen of England. She was not a soldier. That fracture would shape her childhood. While others learned the prayers of Rome, she studied Latin under a Protestant sun. While other girls played with dolls, Elizabeth conjugated Greek verbs and translated Cicero by double reflection, Latin to English, then English back to Latin. Word perfect, not for display, but for mastery. And beneath each grammatical inversion was a deeper message: perfection, precision, control. She learned to rule her mind so that no one else could. At an age when most children chased butterflies, she chased clarity. Her lessons were not merely intellectual, they were theological, political, and deeply defensive. She had no right to power, and yet she was being forged to hold it. The crown was not promised to her, but her mind was trained to deserve it. Behind the soft silk of her writing, behind the perfect lettering of her letters, a calculation stirred. She learned silence not as submission, but as survival. And still, the world did not forget whose daughter she was. Every time she entered a room, she carried the face of Anne Boleyn, the woman many considered a witch, a seductress, a usurper. Her body bore the memory of betrayal, even as her presence suggested legitimacy long denied. And the court, like a cruel mirror, never let her forget. She was watched, weighed, and measured not as a child, but as a warning. She bore the burden of a lineage both sacred and scandalous. She had not led armies. She had not inherited an unchallenged birthright. What she inherited was suspicion, scandal, and centuries of precedent declaring that women were not fit to rule. To some, she was a Tudor. To others, a walking blasphemy. Elizabeth did not cry publicly, did not rage. Instead, she read, she embroidered, she translated. She withdrew into the only sanctum no one could invade her intellect. There she sculpted the self no one could revoke. At 12, she presented her father with a New Year's gift, handwritten in 3 languages, bound in crimson velvet and embroidered with golden thread, a gesture of piety. Yes, but more than that, a subtle reclamation of affection. In her eyes, Henry was not the man who destroyed her mother. but the godlike figure who could still restore her name. Her longing was not naive, it was tactical. For Elizabeth understood early what others took years to learn, that in courts of power, emotion is leverage. She did not plead, she performed. She did not demand love, she made herself impossible to discard. And so, Henry, in his final years, softened. In 1544, he restored both his daughters to the line of succession, not as equals to Edward, his long-awaited son, but as contingents, as possibilities. It was not a full forgiveness, but it was a door left unlocked. Elizabeth had re-entered history, not by fate, but by finesse, and yet the pain lingered. She remained a daughter of annulment, of execution, of theological rupture. Her very name was a compromise between law and legacy. To survive in such a world, she could not be ordinary. She would not be ordinary. She would become a mirror too polished to pierce, a shadow too graceful to trap, a bastard child. Yes, but not a forgotten one. She was only 14 when the games began, though she would not recognize them as games until much later, when the silence they left behind spoke louder than their laughter ever had. Her hands, delicately outstretched to receive the oil of consecration, had once clutched letters written in terror, begging for life. Sudley Castle stood draped in perfumed shadows, and in its stone corridors moved a man who mistook proximity for possession. Thomas Seymour, handsome, bold, and fatally unwise, was no stranger to ambition or appetite. As the Lord High Admiral of England, he knew what power looked like, but in Elizabeth, he saw something he could not easily name. Something more than bloodline or opportunity. She was young, yes, but not soft. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, she chose her words as one chooses a blade carefully, with purpose. She did not flirt, but she noticed. She did not pursue, but she registered pursuit. Seymour, her stepfather by marriage to Catherine Parr, had the look of a man used to being wanted. But with Elizabeth, his touches were half jokes, his gestures cloaked in play. What began as morning romps in the garden, cutting her gown into ribbons while the Queen laughed, slowly became more silent. Intrusions, uninvited visits to her chambers, slaps on her thighs masked as tickles. Early entrances when she was still dressing. The servants giggled. The court looked the other way, and Elizabeth she neither fled nor encouraged. She endured. Like stone endures rain, like fire endures smoke. She had learned early that protest without power was perilous. So she mastered ambiguity. She rose earlier to avoid his presence. She lingered behind curtains. She made herself invisible in her own home, a ghost who refused to be touched, but could not leave the haunted halls. Catherine, once in love with Seymour, grew silent, even as her belly swelled with child. Her smile faded, and her voice became a hollow echo of suspicion. She saw what was happening. She had eyes, after all, but perhaps she had hoped that Elizabeth's innocence would be armor enough, that Seymour's attention was transient, a foolish dalliance of ego. It was not. The flirtation grew teeth. Elizabeth was clever, but not yet wise. She did not yet understand that in royal households, private games become public crimes. And now, with 1,000 eyes fixed upon her, she became the sacred body of the kingdom itself. The oil was traced across her brow, her breast, her palms. When Catherine gave birth and then died days later, dissolved in fever and pain, perhaps as much from betrayal as childbirth, Seymour's mask dropped. He wasted little time in reigniting his pursuit of Elizabeth, this time with marriage in mind. It was no longer coy touches and playful threats. Now it was calculation. He wrote letters. He sent gifts. He made his intentions known to those around her. And still, Elizabeth said nothing. Silence had become her sanctuary. She did not encourage him, but neither did she fully rebuke him. Some called it complicity, others strategy. But to Elizabeth, it was survival. She understood now what it meant to be a woman in proximity to the throne. Every gesture could be mistaken for seduction, every refusal punished as treason. Thomas Seymour was not just a man with desire, he was a man with access. And Elizabeth was not just a girl, she was an heir. Their proximity was no longer a matter of scandal, it was a matter of state. Then came the interrogations. After Seymour's plot to kidnap the young King Edward unraveled in farce and blood, he was arrested. The Tower of London opened its gates once again, and this time they came for those around Elizabeth. Her beloved governess, Cat Ashley, was imprisoned. Servants were questioned. The girl herself, now 15, was summoned and accused not outright, but by implication. Her silence was interpreted as defiance, her calmness as guilt. They wanted her to confess to love, to lust, to conspiracy. She gave them only dignity. No letters surfaced, no admission, only the pale image of a girl who had learned that men's ambitions often arrived wearing smiles. 7 points of anointing, each stroke a contradiction: the virgin, the traitor, the scholar, the survivor. Rumors swirled that she was pregnant. She had been complicit. She had written him poetry. She had plotted with him to seize the crown. She said nothing. She waited. And eventually, the storm passed because without proof, even suspicion must rest. Seymour was found guilty and executed. His head rolled on Tower Hill, and Elizabeth, for the second time in her life, watched a man who claimed power through proximity to her body fall into disgrace. But something in her changed, not with rage, not with grief, with recognition. She understood now, fully and without illusion, that to be female and powerful in England was to live in a corridor lined with doors, none of which she could open without danger. Marriage was no longer romance. It was politics with hands. Courtship was strategy with breath. Elizabeth did not weep for Seymour. She did not pray for his soul. She studied his downfall like she would a Latin clause carefully, noting every consequence of every word. When questioned later about what happened in those days, she neither denied nor confessed. She let the ambiguity protect her like armor too thin to see, but too sharp to penetrate. Those around her noticed the shift. The light in her eyes grew colder, her smile more measured. Even her dress changed. She rejected the ornaments of courtly femininity, her hair unadorned, her gowns simple, her face free of paint. It was not modesty. It was message. I will not be touched. I will not be bait. I will not be undone by the games you play. Her tutors remarked that she studied with greater focus. Her prayers grew longer. Her letters, once filled with playful Latin epithets, became precise, legal, weaponized. The girl was becoming steel, not with fire, with ice. And yet beneath it all was a bruise that never quite healed the violation not of her body, but of her space, her safety, her name. No crown had ever weighed so heavily on a head so familiar with the axe. Elizabeth did not inherit her throne. Seymour had tried to possess her. History would try again. They all would, one by one. Suitors with crowns, kings with armies, ambassadors with veiled threats, each believing that beneath the crown there must still be a girl who once played hide-and-seek behind a curtain, who once laughed when her gown was torn, who once stood frozen in her bed as a man opened the door she had no power to lock. But that girl was gone, or rather, she had been buried, not killed, not forgotten, but buried, beneath grammar and gospel, beneath ritual and restraint, beneath a voice that now spoke in riddles and a face that revealed nothing. They thought they had shamed her. They had not. They had made her dangerous. She had learned early that crowns were not worn, they were survived, but nothing in her education, Not even the brutal arithmetic of Seymour's downfall could prepare her for what it meant to walk the line between heir and heretic. The year was 1554. Her brother Edward was dead. The child king consumed by illness and expectation. In his final months, he had tried to rewrite succession itself, banishing both his half-sisters and naming Lady Jane Grey delicate, pious, tragically naive as queen. That experiment collapsed within days. Now Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and the old religion, ruled, and Elizabeth, the younger daughter of Henry's heretical second marriage, stood in the eye of the storm once more. She had thought herself invisible after Seymour. She had buried her name in obedience, draped herself in Protestant modesty, and uttered no words without the veil of courtesy. But silence is not safety when thrones are shifting. The rebellion came like fire through dry grass. Thomas Wyatt, a gentleman of Kent, rose in opposition to Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain. She took it from history like a thief stealing fire. Her coronation was a ritual theater, but unlike her birth. No one turned away. His letter to Elizabeth, carefully phrased, deliberately ambiguous, spoke of providence, of England's fate, of foreign tyranny. She did not answer in writing. She knew better now. But words, spoken or withheld, no longer mattered. Her name had already been written into the rebellion, sewn into its banners, whispered in its camps. She was not the spark. She was the excuse. When Wyatt's forces were crushed and his body quartered, it was not his bones that haunted Mary, it was Elizabeth. A woman who ruled by fear sees threat in every shadow. And so, with the clatter of hooves and the cold breath of February upon the Thames, Elizabeth was summoned to court, under guard. She claimed illness. The doctors, too loyal to challenge her captors, declared her fit to travel. It took her 11 days to cover 23 miles, each one a prayer. When she arrived at Whitehall, she was interrogated not as a subject, but as a symbol. Did she know of Wyatt's intentions? Did she correspond? Did she desire the throne? The answers didn't matter. The question was itself the verdict. In the end, she was told to write a letter to her sister, the Queen, not to plead, not to confess, but to speak, to explain her innocence. And so, at her writing desk, beneath the weight of centuries and the eyes of her enemies, she took the quill. The ink bled slow, the script precise. She began with dignity, "I humbly beseech your majesty." But as the lines unfolded, her composure began to unravel.